Here this afternoon, this book reading. So my name is Steve Zeltzer, and I'm with the LaborFest Organizing Committee. And we're happy to host this event today. LaborFest was started 28 years ago. It's a long time, actually, for the festival, but started to commemorate the San Francisco General Strike and in 1934, because that strike actually was a critical part of American labor history. And it also brought together black and white workers in the ILWU. And it led to the organizing of hundreds of thousands of workers in Northern California. That's why Northern California is one of the most unionized areas in the United States. And most importantly, you know, it brought together workers' power. And that's one of the reasons that the bosses don't like general strikes. Because in general strikes, workers come together regardless of race, religion, nationality. It brings unity of the working class. And that's what we desperately need in this country right now with what we're facing. So LaborFest has had many events on history, on culture, on art and music. And this year as well, we're going to be having a boat ride on July 31st, honoring a number of people. Ann Feeney, who was a singer, Rua Graffis, who's a taxi cab organizer and trainer, Al Rojas, who's the co-founder of the United Farm Workers, and Terry Collins, who is a comrade of ours who was in the San Francisco State Strike with me and Danny and Clarence. So this history is critical for the working class, and we are also expanding LaborFest to other places. We are going to have an event on the general strike in Minneapolis, which took place on July 20th, which was another important historical development of the working people in this country. And we're going international. We're going to have an event with Japanese trade unionists on Fukushima and the Olympics and the pandemic. The idea that you could have an Olympics in the middle of a pandemic, I think that's a sign of criminal insanity. I mean, bringing thousands of people together in a dangerous time of the pandemic. But what it's about really is capitalism, profiteering, the television companies wanting to make money. And the other thing is we're going to have an event with the miners of Namibia, the leadership of the Rossing mine, uranium mine, who've been fired and are fighting for their jobs back. And Zoom actually has offered a vehicle to bring people together internationally, working people, including Palestinian trade unionists. And we're going to have an event tomorrow morning with Palestinian trade unionists and South African comrade, and also Rabab Abdul Hadi, who is a professor at San Francisco State, and the struggle to defend the Ahmed program at San Francisco State. So all these struggles are brought together by LaborFest, and we are continuing. We want your support, and I say this history has to come forward today by the struggle of working people. We need it more than ever. So the first person I'm going to introduce is Gennaro Baltrap, and he's on the executive board of ILWU Local 10, has been active in supporting the fight against privatization and for workers' rights in New Orleans, where the hoppers went on strike for decent conditions and for PPE. So welcome. Thank you.
Well, I was asked to come up here to introduce this brother Clarence Thomas, and his book. And I just wanted to, I don't know if Brother Clarence remember when he met me. He was it was at, they were fighting against the pensioners. It was PMA, and we were in front of the PMA office.
In Oakland, that's right.
Yes, and you introduced me to a brother that was an artist at the same time, too. And we met at Mayday, the Mayday committee, and we worked together with Mayday, and Brother Clarence was sitting there helping me out tremendously because I was chairing the meeting, and I needed to know the Robert Rules of Order. And he was sitting there like whispering in my ear, letting me know what to do and when to do it. And I was like, thank you, thank you, thank you. I just really appreciate this brother. And being a Local 10 member is an honor to work with brothers like this and know that there's a foundation here. There's something that started a long time ago, way before me, that gives me these opportunities that I have today. And I just appreciate that. And then Brother Clarence captures it in this book, Mobilizing in Our Own Name. And it's just, I'm gonna hand it over to Brother Clarence now.
It's wonderful when people can say things about you and don't have to make up lies, be authentic and tell the truth. I just wanted to say, and he knows this, my wife is an educator, and she worked at the San Francisco Unified School District at one point. And so one of her close friends, Fred Nahal, they named the school after her. It was first Burton, but when Gennaro was attending, it was Burton. And I reminded Sister Howell how one of her students that came out of her high school was an active member of Local 10 and how much her influence had on his life. So it's just good to see how we pass, he's a San Franciscan, by the way, like Brother Danny Glover. I'm going to break with tradition, but before I do that, I would like all the ILWU members who are here to stand up, even if you're a retiree. Okay. Brother Frank Jefferson, would you raise your hand? This is Brother Frank Jefferson, another San Franciscan. Brother Frank is the third generation longshore worker. He looks very young, but he started working on the waterfront quite young. And was it 1982, Frank?
It was 82, yes.
1982. And what I wanted to point out is that in 1995, Frank Jefferson, Leo Robinson, Howard Seacreeves, Douglas Delaney, A.J. Mitchell, and a couple of others whose names I cannot recall, we all were at the historic Million Man March in 1995, where some nearly 2 million, predominantly African-American men. And when we put that in historical context, that was one of the largest strikes of black men in the United States of America. It was not framed that way because labor was not on the podium. But 10 years later, for the 10th anniversary of the Million Man March, we were on the podium with Minister Farrakhan's blessings because we explained to him that the majority of black people in this country are workers. Yeah. So I just wanted to mention that, and that's also documented in the book, and there's a historic photograph. And thank you, Frank, for making that photograph possible. Okay. Brother Frank Jefferson. Brother Danny Glover has another engagement to attend, so what I'm going to do is to introduce him so that he can make his other commitment. I've known Brother Danny Glover for over half a century. Gee, I never thought that I could say that. He and I, we were youngsters when we first met. Now, he remembers us meeting at San Francisco State Extension, but actually we really had met at City College of San Francisco before that. You probably don't remember that, because we weren't sticky, closely friends. But let me just say this. Danny and I enrolled at San Francisco State in 1967. And I don't mind saying it, we were a part of the special admissions EOP, the precursor to the EOP program. The Black Student Union wanted to bring some non-fraternity boys onto campus who they believed were committed to using their education for the betterment of the community. And we had to accomplish certain preconditions. Remember, Danny? Yeah. We had to read Franz Fanon, The Wretched of the Earth. We had to read a book by Dr. Nathan Hare with the Black Anglo-Saxons. Yeah. It was so many books that were required reading. And it was men like Jimmy Garrett, Benjamin Stewart, who succeeded Jimmy as the chairman of the Black Student Union, Brother Jerry Bernardo. That's where we met Brother Terry Collins, who recently transitioned just a few days ago. Brother, that was the first brother who really introduced me to dialectical materialism and Marxist-Leninism, a real, true revolutionary who did not allow contradictions and petty and ideological differences to get in the way of the work. His contributions has touched the hearts of so many, and we are all deeply saddened by his passing. But to get back to Brother Danny Glover, we hadn't been on San Francisco State's campus a full semester before we got thrown out. We were standing up against white supremacy and systemic racism at San Francisco State. And the Gator newspaper were writing some very racist articles trying to undermine our ability to get funding for a special, the experimental college. I'll leave it at that. But let me just say this. It's the friends that we make when we are young are some of the most important because there's no preconditions on that. The things that he and I have gone together, he's a true friend. I mean, a true friend. A comrade too, but a true friend. He has contributed so much to the struggle in the tradition of Paul Robeson, Harold Belafonte. I can go on and on. But let me say this. He's genuine. He believes. He has put his career in jeopardy for positions that he's believed in. Nina Simone was the individual's name that I was trying to remember. Nina Simone, another one. He's a person who has given his time and money. When you read this book, this anthology, he's throughout this anthology. He's a person who will allow himself not to be put into categories based on ideology. And that's one of the things I admire about him. People who consider themselves progressive Democrats, he'll work with them as long as they're committed to the work, not because they're Democrats. We on the left have to work with each other wherever we find each other. But I just want to say this about Brother Danny Glover. He has been a part of so many May Days that ILWU Local 10 has initiated, including May Day 2008, when we shut down all 29 ports on the West Coast, including Vancouver. The first time in the history of the American labor movement that a union has gone out on strike, not for wages and benefits, but to oppose U.S. foreign policy. He was there for that. He has been here when we have spoken out against issues of white supremacy, systemic racism, police terror. I can't even count the number of May Days that this brother has attended and participated in. He is a true friend and a true revolutionary. I will now not embarrass him any longer and let him speak for himself. The one and only Brother Danny Glover.
I think, I call him Buzz. I think Buzz kind of went over the top a little bit. When I think about mobilizing in our own name, and at the time of organizing the Million Worker March, Buzz and I were in constant contact with each other as he began to, and others, those who work in the service of justice, began to move toward this process of a march. And I think about this right here. This represents not only his life's work, but the life work of those who come before him, whether it's his father and other men. I walk into this hall right here, and there's so much incredible energy in this hall, and so many memories in ILWU Local 10. As was mentioned early, the 1934 strike. we shut down ports all up and down the West Coast. And it was an incredible statement by Harry Bridges when he said he went around to all the churches, black churches, and he said, and there was no Bay Bridge there were no other ways, and there was the Golden Gate Bridge. He said, if you don't become scabs on this strike, to black churches, if you don't become scabs on this strike, if you don't betray us right here, I promise you that black men will be on the docks when we win the strike. The operative word was that we're gonna win the strike. And I remember that, and that the fortitude of that, the incredible insight of that. This is a man who was an Australian socialist, who they tried to kick out of the country so many different times, like they kicked out socialists and communists at that particular point. But here he was, in a sense, saying that we're dedicated to changing the dynamics of race in this union. We're going to bring black men to the, and now black women, but now black men to the docks when we win. And when I think about this work, and whatever the opportunities I have, I don't become an actor if I'm not involved in any movements, whether it's the anti-apartheid movement that we all were involved in, or the other thing. There's no platform for me to come on. Just the incredible moment at San Francisco State College, and it changed my life, that life. Buzz and I would walk up the hill on Powell Street to State College Extension, trying to find a way in which we could get into state. And that those conversations found ourselves there, and like he says, the beginning. But the beginning becomes before that, because we're part of that generation of generation in response to the civil rights movement and the black power movement and all the women rights movement, all those, we're part of that generation in that sense. Paul Robeson said that each generation makes its own history and is judged by the history that they make. And that, in a sense, is what we were judged by, that history. And we'll be judged by the history, but we also know that we, in a sense, use all our intellect, all our incredible will, and all of that back history, all of that, to move forward. And to be proud of that, be part of that moment for all of us. The book here, Mobilizing in Our Own Name, is not the continuation of that struggle, the continuation and making that struggle and the continued struggle the most important thing that we can do at this particular point in time. Steve said, man, when I said it, it's crazy now. It is, this country, what is happening in this country, what is happening in the world. And we have to do the work that we have to do still, so that other generations take the mantle and continue to struggle for justice and continue the work that others had done before us. And so it is my pleasure to be here and to be part of this particular moment for not only Buzz, but also all workers, and specifically the workers who are part of the ILWU. Thank you.
At this time, I would like Alan Benjamin to stand, please. Alan Benjamin. Ralph Schoenman. Thank you, Brother Ralph, Comrade Ralph Schoenman. Ralph Schoenman was the chairperson of the Million Worker March Committee. Alan Benjamin was one of the early supporters and organizers. His newspaper, Independence, and The Organizer played very important roles in terms of promoting the Million Worker March, challenging the officialdom of labor. Also, too, His voice is heard when you read this book, Mobilizing in Our Own Name. Alan is all through that book. Alan has played a very important role in terms of supporting the ILWU. My first visit to Paris was arranged because of comrades like Danielle Glickstein in Paris, invited me over so that I could explain the attacks that the Bush administration was waging against the ILWU. I can go on and on and on. Ralph Schoenman. All you got to do is look up Google to find out who Ralph Schoenman is. A true intellectual. From Princeton University to the London School of Economics. Comrade of Che Guevara. I had to read all of this to believe that a man could actually live a life like this. Ralph Schoenman stepped into the scene of the Million Worker March at a very important moment. I will forever be grateful to his contributions. He made it possible for Dick Gregory to be there, for Martin Luther King III to be on the podium. Ralph, I am so glad that you are still with us when this book came out, because that was very important to me. So many revolutionaries are people who call themselves revolutionaries. They don't have time to write things because they're too busy making revolution. But what about the young people who are coming behind us? They need to have a blueprint. They need to have the wisdom of our experience. And I just wanted to say how much it meant, Ralph, for me to work with you on the Million Worker March. And I'm glad that you are here today.
My privilege, my honor, Clarence, your brother, and any luck to be part of this struggle will continue to be.
You heard it from the man himself. The struggle continues. Thank you, Ralph, for everything. And Maya as well. I don't want to overshadow you. We'll talk later. You look great, Ralph. There are so many in the room. Judy Greenspan is here. Would you stand, Judy? Mary Jane is here. Mary Jane has a farm in the Delta. She's here today with us. Nancy, one of the early supporters of the Million Worker March. Cosme, Turi, and Steve Zeltzer to my right. Let me just say this. We have so much ILWU history that has been documented as a result of the Labor Video Project and the work that Cosme and Steve have done over the years. Very, very important work. Brother LaBoissiere, would you please stand? Pierre LaBoissiere. His daughter, Ayana. Yes, she worked as a secretary for the Million Worker March, or administrative assistant, I believe, while she was going to, was it Columbia where she was attending school? My memory is not failing me. David Welsh, another comrade. Many of you may know about the calamity that befell Dave a few years ago. He was seriously injured. It's a miracle that this brother is standing. Thank you so much, Dave, for everything that you've done for the struggle. Lisa Milos. Lisa. Yes, would you please stand, Lisa? We just want to acknowledge you for all the work that you have done. I became familiar with Lisa when we had Victor from Cuba. You were his translator. Sharif? Yes. Sharif from Iraq. Would you please stand? Oh, the Zionists have been busy. Boy, I tell you, it's you have something you wanted to present?
I did, yeah. I wanted to present this to you, Clarence, just as a gift.
Oh, hold on. Steve, do you mind if we stand? Take this picture, please. From Ferguson to Palestine. Get in this, Danny, please.
Right here.
From Ferguson to Palestine, occupation is a crime. Yes.
My favorite one is an injury to one is an injury to all. Tear down the Israeli apartheid wall.
Let's say it again. An injury to one is an injury to all. Tear down the apartheid wall. All right. Thank you so much. Thank you so much for being here.
I'm sorry, I get it. I have
Another engagement.
I have an engagement, a fundraiser for Nina Turner, who's running for Congress in Ohio. And but thank you so much. Okay.
He's got to go.
All right then.
All right.
Okay then.
Don't forget your book.
Yeah. Oh, you shoot no. Thank you, Danny. All right then. Thank you, Steve. Yep. We talk. Okay, baby.
Okay,
All right.
Okay.
All right. Then.
Let's hear it for Brother Danny Glover. Okay, let me get down to business here. I'm sorry we got off such a rocky start, but San Francisco is a beautiful city, but traveling here is a challenge. I want to thank each and every one of you who came here today. First of all, I'm supposed to be doing a reading. Okay. Well, I'm going to start from the back of the book, believe it or not. I'm going to start with about Clarence Thomas, so that everybody in the room can know something about my background. Who is this guy, and why are we all here? Let's start with that. I was born and raised in Oakland, California, the eldest of 5 children. I come from an African-American working-class family.
You both the eldest of 5 children.
Oh, by the way, my sister Marilyn Thomas is in the back. Would you please stand up, Marilyn? She's been the one taking your money this evening. She's one of my twin sisters who also attended San Francisco State and was a part of the mass arrest. You remember that, Steve?
Of course.
Yeah, she was part of the mass arrest.
I escaped it.
You escaped. Very good. So anyway, my father introduced me to Malcolm X. He purchased Muhammad Speaks newspaper on a regular basis. And it was through reading that newspaper that I learned of the Southern Africa liberation struggle. My parents allowed Black Panther Party community meetings to be held in their home. I had a long and profound curiosity about working on the waterfront as a young boy. I was told many times by family members that there were people from all walks of life and various levels of education who worked together there. It was difficult for me to conceptualize such a work environment until years later when I became a longshore worker. I'm a 3rd-generation longshore worker and a retired member of the International Longshore and Warehouse ILWU Local 10, which represents dock workers along the Pacific coast and 29 ports, including Hawaii, British Columbia, Canada. I was a member of Local 10 for 31 years before retiring in 2016. My maternal grandfather, Lee Edwards, came to Oakland with his family during the Great Migration of African Americans from Port Arthur, Texas, to work in the shipyards of Henry J. Kaiser, building Liberty ships for World War II. He became a longshoreman in 1944. My father, Clarence Thomas Sr., came to Oakland with his parents and siblings in 1936 from Merrill, Mississippi, like other families, to escape Jim Crow. He became a longshoreman in 1963. My great-uncle, Robert Harmon, became a longshoreman in 1965. They were all members of the ILWU Local 10. My earliest memory of being introduced to the ILWU was at the home of my maternal grandparents, Lee and Jewel Edwards, who resided in West Oakland, minutes from the Port of Oakland. The first time I recall hearing the name Harry Bridges, founding member of the ILWU and its first international president, was at my grandparents' kitchen table. My grandmother Jewel was a gourmet cook that introduced me to Louisiana gumbo, boiled crawfish, fried okra, stewed tomatoes, and shrimp. You get the idea? Grandpa Lee was a Louisiana Creole with dark skin. His hair was straight as any European. He spoke with a Creole accent, stood 5'7", and was sturdily built. Grandpa Lee worked in an all-white gang, that's workers that always work together, and would on occasion bring co-workers to home for lunch. It was during these meals that there would be discussion about the union, the job, and Harry Bridges. At that time, I was 8 years old. I can't recall the particulars of the discussions, but I gathered that Bridges was an important man. It was my grandfather who introduced me to the importance of Paul Robeson. It was decades later that I learned that the legendary singer, actor, and orator and civil rights leader was made an honorary member of ILWU in 1943. I found it rather curious that a black man that my grandfather held in such high esteem, who was world famous in the same way as the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King and Jackie Robinson, was someone whose name I had never heard at school. Later, I came to realize that Paul Robeson had been blacklisted. His accomplishment had been hidden from the consciousness of an 8-year-old. My grandfather told me that the government accused him of being a communist. I didn't quite understand the full ramifications of the McCarthy era and the Cold War. I attended Oakland public schools. I graduated from Oakland Technical High School, as did classmates Congressman Ron Dellums, former mayor of the city of Oakland, and Leo Robinson, legendary Local 10 and rank and file leader. Both men had prominent roles in the anti-apartheid struggles. Aside from being raised in a union household with all the benefits thereof, I strongly believe that all three of us, having fathers who were members of Local 10, influenced our radicalism and social justice activism. Accompanying my father along with my grandfather R.G. Thomas Paternal and Lee Edwards to see the Reverend Martin Luther King Jr. in the Oakland Auditorium to mark the 100th anniversary of the Emancipation Proclamation on December 28, 1962, was a momentous occasion of my youth. My post-secondary education included attending City College of San Francisco State College, and University of California Hastings College of the Law. My activism started in the late 60s at San Francisco State. While there, I was part of the leadership of the longest student strike in U.S. history. That strike was organized by the Black Student Union and ended with the establishment of the first United States Black Studies Department and School of Ethnic Studies. Many other schools followed our example and changed academia forever. I was introduced to black radical thinkers such as Frantz Fanon, W.B. Du Bois, and others, learning the power of self-determination. I was radicalized at San Francisco State College. There I experienced the importance of building coalitions, such as the Third World Liberation Front, formed by students of color that waged a successful strike for 4.5 months. I acquired the knowledge of organizing rallies, writing leaflets, conducting press conferences, public speaking, and most importantly, how to engage in protracted struggle. I was arrested at San Francisco State College, challenging white supremacy and systemic racism. The ILWU expressed strong solidarity during the strike. Local 10 provided work on the docks to faculty and students who were going without paychecks. While a student at San Francisco State College, I was also an active member of the Black Panther Party and part of the Black Liberation Movement, and understood the importance of black revolutionary working class political leadership and the struggle for freedom, justice, and social transformation. I learned the importance of grassroots community organizing, building movements, political education, and mobilizing students to utilize their knowledge and skill to serve the needs of the community. I entered the maritime industry after the passing of my father in 1985. I have served as an officer in various other capacities during my membership in Local 10. I have been a part of many historical, economic, and social justice struggles for African Americans, the working class, and the oppressed. This anthology documents many of those struggles. Although I am retired from the waterfront, I am not retired from the struggle. Okay, so now you know a little bit about me. Let me first of all say thank you to LaborFest for making this event possible, and thanks to ILWU Local 10 for making this facility available to us today. We've been faced with many challenges, as you know, as it relates to COVID-19. So we're very grateful for the union for allowing us to be here today. Brother Trent Willis was not feeling very well and was not able to make it. Otherwise, he would have been here today. Trent is one of the main reasons as to why we're here in this room. He is currently the president of ILWU Local 10. But when the idea of the Million Worker March was hatched, I received a phone call after one of our union meetings in January of 2004, and it was from Trent. And he had this bright idea about a Million Worker March. And having attended the Million Man March, I could not help but remember the grandeur and the breadth and the grand scale of what that was, and you had to be there to see that particular event. So when he proposed a Million Worker March, it took everything for me not to tell him that I think you might want to give this some thought, brother, because I was there. But you know, something told me not to say that. Something said, well, let me have a conversation with Brother Leo Robinson about this, get back to you. I'm paraphrasing now because this might be a little bit better to move it along. I gave a call to Brother Leo Robinson, who was up late on union meeting nights when he didn't come to a union meeting because he was retired. He always would like to get the 411 on what happened. Leo, he kept a hand on the pulse of the union, even though he was retired. So Leo was a Marxist-Leninist too, but he was one that revolutionaries describe people who can immerse themselves into the community so that people don't know he's a Marxist-Leninist. You understand? And that's the way it should be, because he was a guy who could connect to folks and would not allow his politics to get in the way. But in true Marxist-Leninist fashion, when I called Leo up and I said, I got this call from Trent about having a Million Worker March, and you know, we went to the march, Leo, and Leo said, well, what did you say? What was your response? I said, I told him I would give you a call. He said, yeah. And I knew not to put the damper on what Trent had proposed. He was an emerging leader in the ILWU. He's also a third-generation longshore worker. His father also came into the industry the same time as Leo, my dad, in 1963. That was a very pivotal year for all of you who know about what took place in 1963, the March on Washington and everything else that ensued and prior to that. So Leo suggested that we have a meeting at my home that following Sunday. This was on a Thursday night. So we convened a meeting at my home. And I had Trent, Leo Robinson, and the president of Local 10, who recently passed away, a brother by the name of Henry Graham. We all came to my home, and we had a sit down to discuss this idea of a Million Worker March. And I'm going to do some reading here because I think that it would be important for me to do so. Oh, very good. All right. So this is Roman numeral. So we start out where you see the commentary. You see the page that says commentary? It opens up with Million Worker March, a 21st Century Initiative. Okay, then it's commentary. And by the way, let me just say this. I learned something in writing this book. You may not believe it, but all books have limitations. My original commentary was about 50 pages. The book designer and my wife and another editor said, that's too long. And they start cutting it out. I had so much to say. They say, hey, listen, it's in the book, so you don't need to talk about it. But anyway, I wanted to talk about it. So I told you how I mentioned how, I had gotten this phone call and all this kind of stuff. I couldn't help but reflect on what the Million Man March looked like. So let's go to shaping the MWM details of the meeting, 2 points. 2 things stand out in my mind about the initial meeting. The first thing I recall was that I had a copy of President Franklin Delano Roosevelt's second Bill of Rights on my dining room table, and the second was Leo Robinson's concern that the Million Worker March resolution would not be blindsided or red-baited before we got it off the ground. And as many of you know who've been associated with ILWU Local 10, no matter how close or how much community work or work that we do to get elected officials elected, at some point, our politics of being left, blacklist, and all of that comes into play. And Leo knew if we were to put forward a resolution that this was going to happen, that people were going to be, trying to undermine this thing because it comes out of ILWU Local 10. The local that opposed the internment of the Japanese in 1943. The local that refused to ship nickel and metal to fascist Italy after they invaded Ethiopia. The local that refused to ship scrap iron to Japan in 1939 after Japan invaded Manchuria. So that's the history of the ILWU. And Leo knew anything that we would come up with, people were going to be trying to blindside it and undermine it because it comes out of ILWU Local 10. So that approach reflected Leo's experience in building movements, his understanding how conservative business union advocates viewed the history and reputation of Local 10 in the labor movement. We agreed that the language had to be embraced by a broad section of the labor movement. We found a key in President Roosevelt's January 11, 1944 State of the Union address, the second Bill of Rights. Roosevelt contended that political rights protected by the U.S. Bill of Rights had proven inadequate to ensure U.S. citizens' equality in pursuit of happiness. It is for that reason that the third whereas in the resolution proposing a Million Worker March read as follows, and we talk about Franklin Delano Roosevelt. This was an attempt to be able to build broad-based support for the Million Worker March. That strategy was very effective. And the reason why we know that it was, because the AFL-CIO had to issue an edict to all of their state labor federations saying that do not devote any money, do not devote any material support to the Million Worker March. Then they had this BS disclaimer saying, while we may agree with many of the aims and objectives, well, how could you? How could you be against workers' right to organize? How could you be against ending Taft-Hartley? How could you be against a national living wage? How could you be against affordable housing? How could you be against eliminating these corporate free trade agreements if you call yourself a trade unionist? Now, many of them would say that they support these things, but you and I know that they really don't. it wasn't the time. Oh, that was the other point. It wasn't the time. Listen, I'm glad you brought that up, Alan. Many of us who are engaged in struggle don't always know about previous struggles that have taken place in another time, in another era. Such was the case of the Million Worker March. I did not know about the March on Washington movement. I knew about the March on Washington in 1963, but I did not know about the March on Washington movement. Previous call for marches in Washington made by black workers. You see that section? Okay. Black radical voices speaking truth to power without the support of the Democratic Party and the officialdom of labor. That's what happened on January 25th, 1941. A. Philip Randolph, president of the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters, proposed the idea of a national mobilization of 10,000 African Americans for a March on Washington movement. 1941. Yeah. MOWM. That's, you know, we had MWM, Million Worker March. They had the MOWM. The purpose was to pressure Franklin Delano Roosevelt to end discrimination in the government hiring, the armed forces, and to gain jobs in the defense industry by demonstrating black mass working class power. And for those of you who may not know, there was a time when A. Philip Randolph was a lefty. Yes, and about socialists, a Marxist-Leninist. At one point, he was a very radical black labor voice in the United States of America. There were many similarities between the March on Washington movement, 1941, and the Million Worker March in 2004. The marches were intended to be independent, militant, political mass movements led by African American trade unionists organized independently of the Democratic Party and the officialdom of labor, with chapters organized across the country, just like with the Million Worker March. People all over the country started chapters and started organizing. In 1941, President Roosevelt opposed the March on Washington movement, having a march and rally at the U.S. Capitol. Same thing happened in 2004. Democratic Party didn't want us to do it, and the officialdom of labor didn't want us to do it. We were rallying at the Lincoln Memorial. Both marches appealed to the waged and unwaged workers and not elected officials. Brother Leo Robinson and others, we insisted there would not be any politicians up on that stage on the day of the Million Worker March. This was our day, not theirs. They serve a different master, Democrats and Republicans. The ruling class has two parties. We don't have one yet.
That's right.
There were two prominent differences between the March on Washington movement and the Million Worker March. The March on Washington movement canceled its mobilization because a deal was reached between Randolph and President Roosevelt. Roosevelt issued Executive Order 8802, which prohibited discrimination in federal vocational training programs, established the first Employment Practices Committee, and ended discrimination in hiring and defense industry contracting with the government. And two, Randolph wanted to minimize the participation of whites. He was quoted as saying, there are some things that, quote, Negroes must do alone. In contrast, the Million Worker March happened, and 10,000 people attended the march and rally at the Lincoln Memorial on October 17, 2004. Two, the Million Worker March reached out to the entire multinational working class. The Democratic Party and the officialdom of labor wanted the MWM called off. They offered no concessions, and we were not considering any. We weren't calling it off come hell or high water. They used the excuse, as Alan pointed out, It's the, quote, the wrong time, suggesting it should be organized the next year after the presidential election. We continued organizing in our own time. And I know most of you in this room are very well read and are historians, one way or the other. We all remember what happened in 2005. That was the year the AFL-CIO split. Change to win emerged. So had we waited until 2005, that would have what had been on the deck to deal with. Yeah. The Million Worker March, a tendency in the labor movement. The NWM represented a tendency within the trade union movement that has manifested itself for several decades. That tendency is a black rank-and-file militancy that is unafraid to express an independent movement that is willing to challenge the more passive traditions of the officialdom of labor and its master, the Democratic Party. An example of this is the League of Revolutionary Black Workers, formed in Detroit in 1969. The LRBW brought together various revolutionary union movements that were forming inside the auto industry and other industrial sectors. It was developed during a period of increasing militancy and revolutionary consciousness in the black working class movement. The Million Worker March was initiated by African-American longshore workers of Local 10 of the ILWU. It's the only predominantly African-American local in the entire West Coast Longshore Division, with a long and glorious radical history that is well documented. It is in the vanguard of the fight for economic and social justice in the labor movement. In 1934, black workers played a key role in the victory of the West Coast waterfront strike in San Francisco. The militancy, unity, and power of that victory still reverberates up and down the West Coast today. I just wanted to underscore very quickly the importance of that 1934 strike and Bridges and other leftists who were rank-and-file leaders here in San Francisco, who were Marxists, who understood the intersectionality between race and class. There weren't that many black people in San Francisco at that time, and unions were very hostile, to say the least, to black workers, and particularly longshore workers. And the majority of the black longshore workers who worked on the waterfront actually got their start from being scabs. That's how they got their start. They crossed the picket line, and the employer would keep a few on. But in the main, the employers would use the black workers to undermine the strike, which further created a division. Now, when I tell my white brothers and sisters when I was in this local that there was discrimination on the waterfront before black people got on the waterfront, they look at me kind of, what are you talking about? They didn't understand that the shape up, when the bosses picked and choose who could go to work based upon nepotism, ethnicity, kickbacks, and the like, that's discrimination. It's also undemocratic. The bosses will, if it was no black folks on the waterfront, it was all white, the bosses are still going to be engaged in divide and conquer. That's how they stay in power. Pitting the skilled workers against the unskilled workers, the crane operators against the lashers, and so forth and so on. It is endless, and we see that being played out today with the discrimination, the systemic racism. And when we reflect on all of the controversy going on today regarding the issue of critical race theory, you've all heard about that, which is essentially telling the truth about America, about how racism, systemic racism that affects the whole country, is not about an individual person's thought or biases about black people. Right. No, we're talking about the structural dimensions of this country, the laws that are organized specifically against black folks that emanate from slavery. White people did not have us in slavery because they thought we were inferior. That came later to justify slavery because it's economic exploitation. I knew I veered off a little bit, but I had to tie that into this. When Bridges and others went to the black church, they were demonstrating that Black Lives Matter in 1934. They knew the power of the black community and were acknowledging it. C.L. Dellums, who was an uncle of Ron Dellums, who was the vice president of the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters, was here in Oakland. He believed that every worker had a right to be in a union. He said when he came to California, he came to Oakland. He said there was 3 things that a black person could do to make a living: work on a train, work on a ship, or do something illegal. He decided to work on a train. His brother, who was Ron Dellums' father, decided to work on a ship. He played a very important role facilitating Bridges and others getting to the black community. September 21st, 1967, the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. comes to the Bay Area, and he's doing fundraisers for SCLC. Harry Belafonte, Joan Baez, and others are doing fundraisers at the Coliseum in Oakland. He had to come to Local 10 because Local 10 had supported his struggle for so many years. When he got to the hall, he said, quote, "I don't feel like a stranger in the midst of the ILWU. We've been strengthened and energized by the support you have given to our struggles. What we need is a radical," I'm quoting now, "distribution of political and economic power so that the nation, almost sick with wealth, there will not be so much poverty," he said. "If the nation cannot provide full employment, then it must grant minimum guaranteed annual incomes." This is Dr. King speaking here in 1967, just 6 months before his assassination. He says, "We're going to organize the unorganized." When I went to Baghdad in 2003, we encountered workers who had organized themselves as the Union of the Unemployed. And organized labor in Iraq did not like that. Why am I saying this at this point? The majority of the American workers don't belong to a union. We're in the minority and getting smaller all the time. Most of the poverty-stricken are people who are working every day. That's what Dr. King said in 1967. "We will organize to make clear that everyone in this country has a right to a living income." The Million Worker March mission statement reflected Dr. King's statement at Local 10 and the 1968 Poor People's March on Washington that he initiated in the Southern Christian Leadership Conference and was carried forward by Ralph Abernathy in the wake of Dr. King's assassination. I want to bring up something that's a very sensitive subject. You know, when we proposed the Million Worker March, we had people from various sectors of the labor movement to come out and oppose it. We had some who were considered to be black radicals who came out and opposed the Million Worker March. Some didn't like the name. It reminded them too much of Minister Farrakhan. Others didn't like the idea that there would be something happening before the Democratic Convention. Others said, well, before you do this, You got to get the buy-off of the officialdom of labor. Now, they call themselves radical. We started seeing all kinds of roadblocks. But one of the biggest came from our own international. And one of the reasons why that was the case, the weekend before the Democratic Party in Boston, Massachusetts, there was what I call a mini labor summit held at the home of one of the most esteemed Democrats at that time, Edward M. Kennedy, at the Kennedy compound. And so what happened was all of the major labor leaders were invited. John Sweeney from the AFL-CIO, Andrew Andy Stern from SEIU was there, James Hoffa Jr. from the Teamsters, James Spinoza from the International Longshore and Warehouse Union. They were all present. And this is what they said. This Million Worker March is a great idea. Wonderful. But now is not the time. We'll do it next year, but not now. Well, as Ralph Shulman would say, they can't solve soap ups with that one. Remember that, Ralph? Solve soap? Yeah. No, we weren't buying that. But the International did. Now, the ILWU Longshore Division had voted to endorse the Million Worker March. But after that powwow they had in Boston, they come back to tell us, hey, Clarence, listen, we got word. We got to call this off. This is not the time for this. Well, we weren't calling off anything. As a matter of fact, Brother Leo Robinson contributed $50,000 of his own money. He's the one who designed these T-shirts. This is how we were able to generate income to organize the Million Worker March. Now, isn't this embarrassing? How a leading rank and file leader of the great ILWU has to come out of pocket from his retirement money and investments to make good on a promise that the Longshore Division had made a commitment to. But once the Democratic Party told its junior partners, we need you in the battleground states, doing what you do best, knocking on doors, getting the vote out. But let's be clear about something. The Million Worker March agenda was anti-imperialist. We want out of Iraq and Afghanistan. It was anti-capitalist, against corporate greed, taxing the rich, cleaning up the environment, national living wage, amnesty for all undocumented workers, and on and on and on. They weren't going along with that program because that's not the program that John, what was his last name? Kerry. He was promoting Wall Street. He was even talking about having Lee Iacocca as a vice presidential running mate. I mean, just all, but he was really showing the working class, listen, you know, you do what you do best. Go out and do the grunt work. Yeah, we'll see what we can do for you. I'm going to wrap this up. I want to say this to each and every one of you who showed up here today. I want to thank you for all coming out. I know it was a challenge, a beautiful day. The traffic was horrendous unless you took BART. But thank you all for coming. I want to make sure that everyone who leaves here today has a T-shirt, okay, whether or not you can afford to buy one or not. I also want to say that this book is self-published. My wife and I had to do this the only way that we could. Now it's time for the marketing. Whatever that you can do in the way of getting the word out about this book is very important. People tell me that the book belongs in high schools and colleges and labor departments. It is, in fact, an anthology, which is the only way that I could have done this. I don't believe, had I done it any other kind of way, that it would have had the reception. And you know, people, I don't take an offense at all when people look through the book and say, oh, what beautiful pictures. You know one thing? When I get a book, I look to see how many pictures are in it, because I want to be able to see what it is that the writer is talking about. Ralph Schoenman's writings are in this book. Alan Benjamin's writings are in this book. Video clips of the work of Cosme Torrey and Steve Zeltzer are in this book. David Welsh, people who were actually involved in struggle, many of them are authors of articles with photographs showing you what it was like. Many of you were probably in many of these photos or in many of these mobilizations. Whether or not it was Oscar Grant, May Day, or the more recent Juneteenth, when Angela Davis spoke before, 15 to 20,000 people at the Port of Oakland, where she was quoted as saying, we're still on the long road to freedom. And when the ILWU takes a stand, the world feels its reverberation. That is not an empty slogan. By the way, many of you know that Angela Davis was made an honorary member of ILWU Local 10 on Juneteenth. The ILWU of today, Local 10, is not the same ILWU of the day of Harry Bridges and Henry Schmidt, Leo Robinson, Howard Keeler, Larry Wright, A.J. Mitchell, and many, many others. Jack Heyman. It's different. And we all need to understand that, which is why it is so important that the work of ILWU Local 10 in support of the Palestinian sisters and brothers was so important. There is not a labor union in the United States of America or the world that has done what ILWU has done. In 2010, when the Israeli commandos killed 9 people on international waters on the Gaza flotilla, we refused to work that Zim vessel for 24 hours in 2010. In 2014, would block the boat 4 days. The Zim Action Committee, Steve Zeltzer and others, shut it down. And then this year, 2021, the Ballons did not work at the Port of Oakland, did not work in LA, did not work in Seattle, did not work in Prince Rupert in Canada. These are revolutionary actions. Make no mistake about it. Thank you all for listening. Thank you for coming. I appreciate it. Thank you, Steve, for making it possible. And have a safe journey home. Please spread the word about the book. Tell them how wonderful I am, how long it took me 16 years to get this done. This is our anthology, folks. Okay, it's our anthology.
Big thank you to Dolores.
Dolores Lemon Thomas, who is my partner. I knew she was smarter than me when I married her, but damn, I didn't realize how much smarter till we started working on this book. We worked 15 months on this book, COVID-19. We were sitting together every day, not exercising, not hugging and kissing, because she couldn't stand me. She said, we got to finish this book. Well, it's finished. Now the real work starts. Thank you all so much for coming. An injury to